Well, welcome to Arbor Day and this presentation on trees. And I was thinking of the ways that this might possibly resonate with your group, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Group within DHS. I know and I respect the priority that your mission has to protect our borders, really from terrorism and from entering the country. But also there's actions that have been taken to protect against national threats to our economy that threatens vectors that threaten our forest and agricultural economy. You know, I see this within North Carolina. I've got the presence of Japanese stiltgrass in the understory. I've got a picture here of that. It's not native. It's an invasive that came over from Southeast Asia back in the 20s, established itself in Tennessee. And it's prolific. It forms these monocultures under these forest canopies, and it prevents any establishment of seedlings that are native to our area from getting a foothold. And it's just basically takes over, and it's very, very menacing, and it can tolerate low light environments, so it has advantages that the native species don't. And so the work that you do to prevent the influx of anything invasive that challenges our native flora is really beneficial. So I appreciate the work that's been done on that area. You know, today my intent is to speak about trees really in a very general sense and share current research, you know, regarding the effects of climate change. And the first thing that I want to mention is that we see, or I've seen, trees through different lenses throughout my life. You know, when I first was enjoying my high school years of going out and hiking and camping in the Appalachians, the trees just basically were a place for shade, a place to get away from in case of thunderstorms or lightning. Didn't really have a sense of, wow, this is incredible, and seeing what's involved there. The detail of it was a miss for me. It wasn't until I got into my summer that I went out west and fought fires for the state of Washington, wildfires, that I began to see within the Cascade mountain range these incredible ecosystems where trees were massive, and just seeing the interrelationship of all the dynamics that I hadn't seen on the East Coast. These trees would really dwarf the hardwoods that I was familiar with. But, you know, honestly, I began to see details really come together when I went back to school at Virginia Tech and started getting into my curriculum and seeing just all the different systems coming together. And it began to really put me in a place of, I guess, humility, because I began to see myself as a small player within this really large narrative that I was just beginning to explore and see. Very humbling. Yet, as I began my work career in forest land management, I was, you know, being able to get into looking at trees through a different lens, looking at trees through merchantability. And so I would see forests now not in the grandeur that I'd seen before, but I'd see them as, you know, the number of 16-foot saw logs I could get out of a tree, or would this stand of timber provide enough pulpwood to supply the paper mill that I was associated with. And so those things come into play. So it changes the way you walk through woods. You know, later, as I got into my second shift in career, as I went back and got a geospatial degree looking at trees from space in remote sensing, I began to see trees not individually or in small groups, but in large regional manners. You know, tree canopies were viewed as a function, for me, of reflected radiation back to the camera or the sensor. Information gained from these reflectances I was able to see in terms of what's called greenness levels or leaf biomass, or above ground carbon. You know, later, my homeowner status got me to see trees through a lens that is beneficial. Trees were beneficial for shading the house and providing that, but also detrimental to my lawn. And so we've got yellow poplars, and they seem to be throwing down biomass at all times of the year. My red maple out front, very nice in the fall, beautiful, However, when those leaves hit the grass, it seems they decompose within seconds. Obviously, I'm exaggerating, but and in their decomposition seems to be a little bit more acidic, and it would just kill off the grass. And then my neighbors that flank both sides of my yards. My neighbors have these large, mature water oak trees, and these trees hold on to their leaves. They don't seem to ever leave until really springtime. By then, the leaves finally have dropped. So they're dropping leaves all the time, and the type of leaf they have, it's really hard to get off the lawn. So that's another lens. So the lens today is really, I've been wanting to talk about this, the amazing aspects and characters of a forest, characteristics of a forest or trees, independently but also within community. There are so many aspects. Billy Joel had a song once called "We Didn't Start the Fire," and in it he describes over 100 references to historical events, all within 4 minutes. And so I feel the same way. I really want to do a deep dive. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but there are so many things we could talk about. And so I've summed it up in this talk briefly into this outline. You can see here, we're going to talk about the leaf itself. We'll talk about the way water moves up a tree. We'll talk about the social dynamics of a forest, later get into adaptations that are really amazing, and then finally look at climate impacts on trees. All right, so all things leaves. My dissertation from the University of New Hampshire was based on assessing leaf biomass from space, from satellites. Very exciting stuff. If you'll humor me, I want to spend a little time on all things leaves. Little freshman biology 101, but we really can't, overlook the amazing process of how leaves convert radiant energy into sugars, and with oxygen as a byproduct. The image that I'm showing here is a cross-section of a leaf, and you see that, just as a refresher, photosynthesis occurs within the chlorophyll molecule, which is found in these chloroplasts that are positioned within the palisade parenchyma. Just a quick summary of the process is that within the chlorophyll molecule, this radiant energy splits the water atom into its component parts, and it creates energy molecules called ATP and what's the other one? NADPH. And it releases this oxygen as a byproduct. These energy molecules then are used in the dark reaction to convert CO2, which is coming in through the stomata, into glucose. This obviously is an incredible oversimplification. However, I like to mention it because, hey, it's the means of existence of life itself. Everything hinges on this. But one thing you got to realize too, the role of forests in terrestrial life, they only provide 30% of the oxygen that's supplied to the globe, the other 70% coming from marine life. I'm a remote sensing scientist, so I need to do a quick detour into leaf colors within the growing season. Different materials, they reflect and absorb, whether they're organic or inorganic, they reflect or absorb electromagnetic radiation differently based on their chemical and structural properties. The part of the spectrum that involves leaf absorption and reflectance really includes the visible region where we see blue, green, and red. We're used to those. We see that in our eyes. But beyond that, to the longer wavelengths, beyond the red edge, they're called near infrared, and then into the far infrared. These are invisible to our eyes. But this contrast between the red and infrared reflectance within vegetation has provided the science community with means to detect vigorous vegetation from vegetation that is stressed. Chlorophyll within the leaf utilizes both the red and the blue spectra. That's why we see green. Green is not utilized, so it's reflected off the leaf. One thing I do want to mention, I have a picture here of my Japanese dwarf red maple. Many of you may have ornamentals that are red in color. What you're looking at is a underperforming photosynthetic churning tree. It's not using the red band to utilize within photosynthetic processes. It's only capturing the blue. It's reflecting the red, it's reflecting the green, and in doing so, it's not efficient. And I think that's why we don't see within forested canopies these red trees. They just can't compete. They can't get up in there. So photosynthesis in and of itself is a game changer. You could say it's a drop the mic moment. However, the leaf has, more intricacies that are amazing, such as the way they adapt to water stress or drought. Leaves adjust to drought stress by regulating the opening and closing of the stomata. These minute openings in the leaf epidermis that allows the interchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide and gaseous water to go between the leaf and the atmosphere. What's incredible is that this process of regulating during drought stress involves a stress signal initiated by a phytohormone called abscisic acid. So increased levels of this acid not only regulate the opening and closing of the stomata, but they also cause increased hydraulic conductivity in the roots and the xylem, and so basically enabling the plants to transport more water and thereby recover more rapidly after water depletion. So, the leaf also functions to filter out pollutants from the atmosphere. Enzymes, which are catalysts for chemical reactions, they're quickly produced in leaves that act to break down these pollutants that enter the leaf stomata. Once the leaf has these volatile organic compounds within its structure, these pollutants trigger an increased production of this enzyme to further break down, again, these pollutants, and it increases the efficiency by 40%. We need to mention, too, on the flip side, though, that trees do emit these volatile organic compounds themselves. Trees emit isoprenes for deciduous trees, and conifers emit terpenes. They're useful. The production of terpenes, for example, within conifers is actually a response to elevated temperatures. It thereby cools the tree. But these natural VOCs produced by trees, they're really not as toxic to human health as those that are emitted in man-made sources. However, they can react with ozone and other chemicals that are in the atmosphere to become really larger compounds. They can react also to human-made emissions, like from diesel vehicles or other fossil fuel burning power plants. In both cases, they form solid or liquid particles that are suspended in gas. So this combination, though, of natural and human VOCs can be seen as haze and gives credence to the naming of our eastern U.S. mountains, like the Great Smoky Mountains or the Blue Ridge Mountains. You can see this image here. This naming comes from this haze and this smoky look that trees give off. So this next section, talking about the social network or social connections, deals with really a paradigm shift that I had to navigate. I was used to terms like competition and succession and dominance and codominance, suppression. These are all descriptors that are used within forest canopies and are usually describing forest succession through an independent lens. Process of describing tree survival and placement within the canopy. From my vantage point, really this paradigm was survival of the fittest. However, there are a number of community and social aspects that are found within forests that show more of a social network, an encouraging of success of neighbors. I want to quote this prominent scientist that we'll talk about later, but she mentions, plants are really not individuals in the sense that Darwin thought they were, individuals that are competing for survival of the fittest. In fact, she says, they're trying to help each other to survive. As an example of this, many trees, they emit chemical compounds as a defense mechanism against insect pests or predators. This helps them recover from damage or to cope from climate change. One amazing example of this is seen in the African savanna, where the acacia tree has adapted defense mechanisms to really ward off overgrazing by giraffe herds. Researchers began to notice patterns of giraffe grazing that really baffled them. Giraffes tended to graze on acacia trees and leaves, but instead of enjoying the bounty and the abundance of that tree or the neighboring trees, would only graze for a few minutes, then move on, maybe 100 meters away. They asked themselves, well, why wouldn't they just stay put? They had ample food around them. It turns out, though, that after mere minutes after grazing begins, the trees themselves would start pumping toxic substances into the leaves called tannins, making them inedible to the grazers. Then they would also emit a gas, an ethylene gas, that would be transmitted to the neighboring trees within the vicinity, and this would register the production of tannins within them. So they would become inedible to the giraffes. So the giraffes would have to move from that clump of trees, and they would move upwind to prevent that signal from reaching where they wanted to go and eat, and they would be able to maneuver and get their food. So both systems are working in play and have adapted to each other. So these acacias, working in concert for protection is really amazing, in and of itself. And however, the greatest finding that I've seen is work that is done by Dr. Suzanne Senard. She studied, the communal aspect of trees with respect to sharing resources through, through fungal relationships in the root system. When I was an undergraduate, I did study symbiotic relationships of fungal mycorrhizae within the root tree system. It was understood that this relationship benefited both the tree and the fungus, where the fungus facilitated the transfer, of nutrients and minerals and water to the tree. Along with this transfer, though, the fungus also served as a filter for heavy metals in the soil. You can see evidence from this activity if you're walking on the forest. Within the forest and on the forest floor, you'll see these different mushrooms in the form of, or the names porcini and sep and bolete mushrooms. So symbiotic fungi are also known to ward off attacks by bacteria. And also one very interesting aspect is that if the host tree is deficient in nitrogen, the fungus itself can release a deadly toxin into the soil to kill off these minute organisms. And in their dying and decomposition, they release nitrogen, which then is absorbed back into the tree. The organism that you see here, this Leucera bicolor, is closely associated with pine trees, and it has this relationship of dealing with producing this toxin. So you have to ask yourself, what benefit do the fungi, what do they receive for all these goods and services that they provide to the tree? In the spirit of reciprocity, the tree supplies, needed sugars for fungal growth, and they've estimated up to a third of all sugars produced by the tree go into this fungal mechanism. So the new discoveries that Dr. Senard started to uncover in her research regarded these relationships underground. She observed that through the mycorrhizae mycelium, these mother trees or dominant trees, or what she called hub trees, were connected through this network of mycelium within the understory and provided needed source energy, carbon, for these saplings, their own saplings, increasing their viability by about 4 times. These excess resources being shared between species was amazing in and of itself. Not only nutrients and water are shared, but also move within the system were defense signals, allele chemicals, and hormones. So as an example, if a mature hub tree was being attacked at some point by insect or disease, it would send defense signals to its siblings through this network, thus increasing their resistance to future stresses. But the most significant finding was not only did the mother tree share resources within her own species, but also she shared it with her competitors. Birch and Douglas fir were seen trading resources. This community ethic challenges, prior theories that trees are independent, solely looking after their own resources for their own development. This really does bring into question the impact of monoculture forest stands that are grown over short durations and are intensively managed. These trees, they're hubless. They don't have that mother tree. They don't have that incredible network that we're describing here. In essence, they have to work independently without the full benefit of this network, this social network. And then questions arise as to the continual disturbance with the mycorrhizae network, given the intense site prep that takes place prior to replanting. This continual soil disturbance can exacerbate these soil conditions where these systems can be affected up to 90%. These are just some of the musings and questions our research is trying to address as climate change, really in concert with human activities, continues on its current trend. So now let's talk about the movement of nutrients and minerals and water up from the soil, through the mycorrhizae mycelium, into the roots, up through the bole of the tree, then finally to the leaves. Last summer, I was deployed to a wildfire in Northern California where I got to see coastal redwoods for the first time. Amazing trees. Yet how to explain how these massive trees, some that I saw were over 240 feet tall, somehow transfer fluids, from the soil to the leaves and needles at that height. And findings, the answers really are in the physics, the action of physics itself, which I am not an expert. I'm not a qualified person from that perspective. But I'm putting a YouTube clip that I'd like you to watch at some point that really describes this process by those who are qualified. But I can give a summary. Historically, the process has been described as a combined process of transpiration, osmosis, and capillary action. However, what they find is transpiration, which is really the suction created through the evaporation at the leaf level, can only pull water to a maximum height of 10 meters. Osmotic pressure, which explains differences between areas that have more salt to those that don't, and then movement of water, really can't explain the movement beyond 10 meters either. And capillary action is also a mechanism that can't work to move water upward based on the width of the tubes that transport these nutrients and the water up, these xylem tubes. They're between 20 and 200 millimeters wide. They're way too wide to move water up. In essence, that in and of itself would only move water about 1 meter. So in our 240-foot high redwood, how to explain? And what they've noticed is that pressures at that height would reach up to negative 15 atmospheres. And at the base of the tree, at the roots, you could find an atmosphere of 1. And so that differential of 16 atmospheres really is a pulling mechanism. It just pulls the the water upwards. In order to do that, though, the water has got to be continuous. There can't be any bubbles within this network of trachea and xylem tissue and everything else. And also, at the stomata, the very small pore openings have got to be very small to prevent the meniscus from breaking. To meet this requirement, the stomata, the pores are about 2 to 5 nanometers in width. And a nanometer, it's a nanometer small. It's a millionth of 1 millimeter. So this is an incredible design. It's just amazing how these systems work. I want to talk a little bit about understanding the amount of water also that moves through a tree, both in ample conditions but also in drought conditions. In drought conditions, they estimate that for every inch of diameter of a tree, 1 gallon of water is moved per day. So a 12-inch diameter tree within a day will move 12 gallons of water. However, on the other end, when ample supply is available, they found, like within a beech tree, a mature beech tree, plenty of water, 230 gallons were moved in a day. And so quite extreme there. And yet, I've always wondered, what does this look like over a growing season? So let's just assume a 4-month growing season, at half the maximum supply. We can assume around 13,000 gallons are transpired per season by one tree. And the picture I'm showing here is a water storage tank that holds 13,000 gallons, this exact amount. So I want you to think about this and expand those water storage tanks as trees within a forest. And they're extracting this amount of water over a season. It's an incredible amount of water that's just being pumped up into the atmosphere. And, it's been described too. One of the things that's very interesting is that 95% of the water is just cranking up, and maybe 4% is used for the photosynthetic processes, and 1% is allowing CO2 to transfer between the stomata and the atmosphere. And so it's just a lot of water going up. So now I want to talk about tree adaptations. Hopefully by now you're seeing these incredible dynamics that occur within a forested ecosystem. These adaptations are kind of like I feel like a type of potpourri of topics that probably has some overlap with other topics. It's hard to pigeonhole them into one label though. But like Billy Joel's song, I feel like to leave them out would not do justice to the narrative of the story of a tree or a forest. So let's start by just chatting briefly about pioneer species. These are trees that are designed to send seed and germinate and withstand conditions that are very harsh, dry conditions, open sunlight following disturbances such as like wildfires or wind throw as an example. Some pine species, they've adapted to this, to fire, by developing thick bark to withstand intense burns. But I want to really focus in on the Serotonin or Pinecone Serotonin. These Serotinous cones are basically cones that are covered with a thick layer of resin. You can see it in the picture here. And they hang really on a pine tree for years, long after the enclosed seeds mature. It's only when a fire sweeps through that the resin is melted off. And these heat-dependent cones, what they'll do is they'll open up and they'll release seeds that are distributed then by wind and gravity. So this picture I'm showing you is of knobcone pine. I took this past summer while I was deployed in Northern California on the McCash fire. You can see that the fire consumed the tree, but the seeds have been released, finding their way into a receptive ash layer, beginning the life process again. So I want to spend a moment again talking about the Quaking Aspen. This tree seen here seems to be a stand of trees in a forest grove. However, in reality, this is actually one DNA stock. It's actually one tree with multiple stems. This image is of the largest living tree organism on Earth. It's located in the western U.S. and it spans over 106 acres. Amazing. Aspen. So what benefit is that to being a pioneer species and getting up into the canopy? So aspen leaves, they're delicacies to western mule deer and to other foragers. And by the aspens producing multiple sprouts, they ensure that foraging will not completely decimate the entire organism. Some of the tree sprouts are going to make it up into the canopy, and they'll continue that DNA legacy. Also, Quaking Aspen is named after the fact that the leaves are in continual motion. You'll see them doing this, and with any type of breeze that comes through the canopy. So this movement of leaves side to side allows sunlight to be captured by chlorophyll on both sides of the leaf. Most leaves only have chloroplasts and chlorophyll on the upper side of the leaf. This adaptation by aspen, though, allows for it to be more efficient in creating sugars for growth. It gets itself quickly elevated into the canopy and out of harm's way from these ungulates. Basically, it's really difficult to eradicate the aspen, the quaking aspen, much like we might face with a zombie apocalypse, of course. A friend of mine mentioned that we need to get our aspen out of here. So one quick note, I do want to finish up this chat on adaptation on a few things here. The first one is on oak trees. Oak trees propagate through their acorn dispersal. And they're a source of food that are enjoyed by many, many foragers. And, if they dispersed on a continual basis, a consistent basis, these foragers wouldn't move. They just continually just gobble up and eat, and nothing would be reproduced underneath these canopies. However, the oaks offset that by only producing acorns every 3 to 4 years. And you may see a bumper crop. And so what happens is the foragers can't get used to the fact that they have a continual food supply. So they move off or they die off or whatever, and it allows these seedlings to get established. So no free meal over a number of years is beneficial. And I do want to mention, I'm from the Southeast, so there's some southeastern states in the U.S. that have been given really a terrible moniker of possible inbreeding where cousins marry cousins. If you're from one of those areas, I apologize, but we all know that DNA swaps between close relatives is not a good thing. And trees, they've developed mechanisms to prevent such inbreeding by preventing cross-pollination with itself and with its kin. Sometime if you're walking through a pine forest, look up and check out the position of the pine cone clusters positioned within the canopy. Typically, you'll see the highest density of cones positioned at the top third of the canopy. So research believe that this is one of the adaptations to avoid cross-pollination with itself. It also has the ability to prevent this cross-pollination, as do other species, by adjusting their pollination schedule with their flowering opening. So if the pollen is released 3 or 4 days prior, the flowers come out, that enables the fact that they're not going to get this cross-pollination. One really interesting tree is called the bird cherry. It's a tree that produces, as many do, both male and female sex organs. And the way it prevents cross-pollination is that when a pollen grain lands on the stigma, its genes are activated. The tree then tests the genetic makeup of the pollen, and if it matches its own DNA, it blocks the tube and dries up. Nothing happens. This mechanism allows only foreign genes to propagate. Enough said. Pretty amazing. All right, finally, hope you're still with me. I want to talk about climate and the effects on trees and kind of future outlooks as far as we can see. Earlier I spoke about reflectances off a tree leaf. I want to now incorporate that part of the discussion and talk about recent work evaluating the recovery of forests to a forested state after something devastating like a wildfire or an insect infestation. Scientists, they've mapped vegetation vigor or greenness using spectral indices, incorporating the red and the near-infrared spectra. And I show this in this comparison between these two satellite images from the Landsat satellite that were captured over Northern California, just north of Sacramento. The image on the left maps land cover by assigning colors to different spectral bands, and these bands are not natural colors, so that's not normally how you would see them from space. They just draw out the differences in land cover. However, the image on the right shows what's called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, where NDVI it maps levels of greenness. Now, using these band ratios, Oh, actually, when you look at that image, you can see the darker the green, the more vegetation vigor there is versus where it's lighter. So using these band ratios or indices, scientists and others are able to address some ecological questions of what might be happening to a landscape following a particular event. So scientists have been investigating the level of really non-return of forest to a forested state following fire or insect infestation. You know, climate change obviously has created a dynamic within the U.S., especially if you live in the western side of the U.S., where fires have been increasing, you know, in number and size and intensity. I've been modeling smoke plume dispersion around wildland fires over the past 3 fire seasons. As I've driven around these fires over the last few years, I've noticed prior burn scars, many years past, not recovering back to its original forested state, but what I see is grasses and brush coming into play more so. You know, here I'm showing results of a study by a number of colleagues of mine at EPA, of a study that's currently in review for publication that addresses this issue of forest non-recovery following disturbance. You know, what they did was use continental scale land cover maps created from vegetation indices from the USGS and other metrics. These researchers were able to assess these change metrics happening since 2001. And this map shows areas where recovery back to forest has not occurred. And it's an area estimated to be approximately the size of, if you take if you look at a map and look at Rhode Island and you take 3 states of Rhode Island and combine them, that's about the size of areas that haven't changed back. So, you know, warmer temperatures and deviations in rainfall patterns, you know, really are a function of human-induced climate change, but also in conjunction with normal climate oscillations that we see in nature, has begun to shift tree populations in the eastern U.S. They've shifted them both north, but more surprisingly to the west, according to research by Sung Lung Fei of Purdue University. Overall, changing climate has pushed trees on average 20 miles north for primarily softwoods and 25 miles west with the hardwoods, primarily the hardwoods, over the past 30 years. And this is about 1 kilometer to 1.5 kilometer shift movement every year. You know, the northern shift really was expected, but what wasn't was the western shift. And researchers believe that the temperatures and rainfall patterns have really dictated that change of pace. I want to close with one closing note on carbon sequestration. You know, we understand that it would be expected with rising CO2 levels that the atmosphere would be enriched for leaf uptake and the reprocessing of carbon into stored long-term carbon sinks. You know, U.S. forests have seen a general uptick in carbon storage of about 10% since 1990. However, the accumulation of carbon in our nation's forests recently has been showing a slowing down, really in part to fire, pest, and disease-related disturbances. A number of studies have shown that there are other mitigating factors that confound a causation. In essence, higher CO2 results in higher temperatures, creating greater water stress, effectively shutting down the leaf to conserve water. So, you know, in the future, the rate of accumulation of carbon into storage will be influenced by really difficult to predict factors such as CO2 fertilization, disturbances, and also a wide range of future economic conditions. And so with that, I want to thank you for allowing me to pontificate on all things trees, and if you have any discussion questions, I would be glad to go over them with you at this time. Thanks.